In parts 1 and 2, we saw how the unemployed Paul Blobel got a badly paying job in the city administration in Dusseldorf at the beginning of Nazi rule in Germany. He was already a member of the National Socialist Party, and so he pulled a few strings within his party circles to get a much better paying position. In his case, it was in the Dusseldorf SD, the Nazi security service, where he was probably keeping an eye on potential opposition activities that could threaten the regime. He must have been very good at his job, as in May 1941 he was called to the Reichssecurity main office, the RSHA in Berlin, where he was probably told that he would be soon mass murdering people in the upcoming invasion of the Soviet Union. If he was not told it then, he was probably told it at his next destination. The next destination was here, the Düben Heath, and the former police border training school in Prech, where the future killers, the Einsatzkommandos, were able to train and get to know each other before leaving a trail of blood in the Soviet Union and those territories that had been occupied by the Soviet Union during its alliance with Nazi Germany. Within a few days of the invasion, Blobel, as commander of Einsatzkommando 4A, was mass killing people. The victims would be asked to report to a location where they would be rounded up by the police or other units and taken to previously dug graves where they would be shot. The killing method was the decision of the local commander. Blobel chose to do it via firing squads, taking groups of around 10 people to the gravesite where they would be made to kneel before being shot. Blobel participated in the largest single mass shooting in one location in history, which occurred at Babi Yar in the city of Kiev. He was in charge of other massacres which occurred in various locations in what is today Ukraine. At the beginning of 1942, he was relieved of his command. Many commanders were rotated. Some had come from the Gestapo, for example, and were sent to another Gestapo posting, but in the case of Blobel it was officially for health reasons. However, it was more likely that he was removed for being an alcoholic, which, I suppose, comes under the heading of health reasons. After a short period of unemployment, he was given a new task. This was to locate and dig up the bodies of the people that had been murdered not only by his Einsatzkommando, but all of them. He was then to burn the bodies, allegedly to remove all traces of the crime, but as the burning bodies were noticed for kilometers around, it's difficult to understand the logic. Once the slaves who burned the bodies had finished their task, they too were murdered. Towards the end of 1944, Blobel's task was completed. He was ordered to Styria in Austria, where he was to be a liaison between the Reichssecurity main office and SS Obergruppenführer Erwin Friedrich Karl Rösener. Rösener was in the region to fight against Yugoslav partisans. Blobel didn't get a chance to start work. He fell ill in December 1944 and was in a sanatorium in Marburg an der Drau, today Maribor in Slovenia, from February to April 1945. On the 11th of April 1945, he was ordered to report to Berlin to the head of the Reichssecurity main office, Ernst Kaltenbrunner. To this end, he set out for Salzburg, where presumably some other transport, such as a train, would be waiting for him. The Battle of Berlin was about to commence. He claimed that in Salzburg there were no orders for him. However, I don't think he tried to get there, or he took so much time that the war was over by the time he got there. He was found here, in Rastatt, where, alongside a number of other suspects, he was taken prisoner at the beginning of May 1945. Blobel was one of the 24 defendants at the Einsatzgruppen trial from the 15th of September 1947 to the 10th of April 1948. This was the 9th of the 12 follow-up Nuremberg trials. In contrast to the main war criminals trial, the Einsatzgruppen trial took place before an American military court, known as the Nuremberg Military Tribunal, or the NMT, and there was no four-power control. Officially, the case was dubbed the United States of America against Otto Ohlendorf, Ohlendorf being deemed the most important SS officer in the dock. In this video, I shall look at the trial insofar as it affected Paul Blobel and not the other defendants. In his testimony at Nuremberg after the war, former SS-Hauptsturmführer Dieter Wisliceny, the Commissioner for Jewish Affairs for Slovakia, Hungary and Greece, said that he first met Blobel in Adolf Eichmann's office in Berlin in November 1942. Dieter Wisliceny testified at various trials and gave thorough evidence. Blobel was under the orders of Eichmann, and he taught Eichmann's staff on what Wisliceny referred to as the Jewish question, as well as his methodology of destroying corpses. Wisliceny next saw Blobel in Hungary in late 1944, when Blobel informed him that the task of destroying the bodies, and thus the work of Sonderkommando 1005, had been completed. Blobel was wrong about that. The Sonderkommando had not been very thorough, as over the next few months the remains of tens of thousands of murdered people were discovered. At the trial, it was the contention of the prosecution that SS Colonel Paul Blobel commanded Sonderkommando 4A from June 1941 to January 1942, and in that capacity he was responsible for the killing of 60,000 people. The defense counsel in its final plea argued that the maximum number of persons executed by Sonderkommando 4A cannot have exceeded 10 to 15,000, as though somehow that made everything all right. The defence claimed that the reports which chronicled the 60,000 killings were subject to error, using a number of rather weak excuses, which, were this not a very serious matter, might actually sound quite amusing. The first excuse was that, as the reports were not made under oath, and that they were made by an officer unfamiliar with the subject covered in the reports, that, therefore, they could not be believed. The defence further claimed that the reliability of the reports could not be believed, as possibly headquarters did not have a map with which to check the locations. Now, if I've understood this argument correctly, this means that as there was no additional check on the place where the killings had taken place, then the location of the murder had to be doubted, and thus the murder itself. Then it said that if the reports are assumed to be correct, it was argued that Blobel was under the jurisdiction of the army, coming directly under the orders of Field Marshal von Reichenau of the 6th Army. Therefore, Blobel's defence tried the superior orders excuse that had already been rejected in war crimes trials. Blobel also claimed that the persons executed by his commander were investigated and tried, and that Field Marshal von Reichenau had reviewed every single case. Therefore, to take Barbie Yar as an example, Blobel was claiming that 33,771 Jews were executed in 2 days immediately after explosions and incendiary fires, for which they had all been found guilty of starting. As far as Barbie Yar was concerned, Blobel claimed that not more than half of the mentioned figure was shot. So it seems that it was not 33,771, but something just under 17,000. Once more, as though that made everything all right. Blobel also claimed that his shootings were done in accordance with international law. He testified, executions of agents, partisans, saboteurs, suspicious people indulging in espionage and sabotage, and those who were of a detrimental effect to the German army were, in my opinion, completely in accordance with the Hague Convention. Blobel might not have been altogether aware of the law if he were of the opinion that he could execute people merely on suspicion. 16 separate reports directly implicated Blobel's commando in mass murder, many of them referring to him by name. The report of the 9th of November 1941 stated that Sonderkommando 4A had executed 37,243 people. Report number 132, dated the 12th of November 1941, tells of the execution of Jews and prisoners of war by Blobel's Sonderkommando. The report closes on the note, the number of executions carried out by Sonderkommando 4A has increased to 55,432. Report number 156 declares that as of the 30th of November 1941, Sonderkommando 4A had shot 59,018 persons. In his final plea for the defendant, defense counsel for Blobel explained his background. In 1924, Blobel began the practice of his profession, that is, of freelance architect. By untiring efforts he became successful, and at last he realized the dream of owning his own home. Then came the economic crisis of 1929. The solid existence for which he had fought and worked was smashed by the general economic collapse. He could get no new orders, his savings disappeared, and he couldn't pay the mortgage on his house. The defense claimed that by then Blobel was down to his last shirt. According to Blobel, this explained his later behavior in going to the Soviet Union to slay tens of thousands of human beings. Blobel joined the SA, SS and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, not because he believed in the ideology of National Socialism, but to improve his economic situation. In 1935 he received an order as an architect to furnish the office of the SS in Dusseldorf. Despite the miraculous prosperity promised by National Socialism, in 1935 Blobel was still very poor, and so he thus decided to take up Nazi work seriously in order to get clothes again. He would give his entire time to National Socialism. He was now working for the SD, gathering intelligence. During the trial, Blobel claimed that he'd attempted to leave the SD prior to the outbreak of World War II, whilst also saying that up to 1939 there was no reason to leave the SD and to turn his back on this organisation. In June 1941, Blobel was called from Dusseldorf to Berlin, took charge of Sonderkommando 4A and marched into Russia. The court heard that in one operation his commando killed so many people that it could collect 137 trucks full of the property of the victims. Blobel's attitude on murder in general was well exemplified by his reaction to the question as to whether he believed that the killing of 1,160 Jews in retaliation for the killing of 10 German soldiers was justified. His words were, 116 Jews for one German? I don't know. I'm not a military person, you see. One can only judge it from a sort of public sentiment and from one's own human ideas. If they are enemies, and if they are equal enemies, the question would have to be discussed whether 1 to 116 is a justified ratio of retaliation. Blobel was found guilty under count 1, crimes against humanity, that is to say mass murder, and under count 2 of the indictment, war crimes, that is to say the needless destruction not justified by military necessity. The tribunal also found that Blobel was a member of the SS and SD under the conditions defined by the judgment and the International Military Tribunal, and was therefore guilty under count 3 of the indictment. On the 10th of April 1948, he was sentenced to death. Of the original 24 defendants in the Einsatzgruppen trial, 13 received a death sentence. These 13 were now to face a long stay on death row. In part 4, we shall look at the efforts to save the lives of these mass murderers, and what may surprise you is that these efforts came from German people who were above all themselves the victims of Nazi persecution. I think that this video will explain why so many Nazi war criminals were to effectively get away with it in West Germany in the years up to unification in 1989.